In the shadowed halls of Greystone Manor, a grand staircase hides a deadly secret. When Lady Beatrice Ashford tumbles to her death, whispers of murder stir among her household, her indebted nephew, her loyal maid, her cautious doctor, and her enigmatic companion. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle demeanor and piercing gaze unravel a web of betrayal, a hidden codicil, and a desperate act that changed everything. In a world of wealth and deception, one push reveals the truth. At what cost? Dive into a mystery where every step echoes with danger. Chapter 1. The Fall at Greystone Manor. The October gale battered the cliffs of Devon, sending gusts that rattled the leaded windows of Greystone Manor. The estate, a monument to old money, stood resolute, its grey stone walls unyielding against the storm. Within, the grand staircase swept upward from the marble-floored hall, its oak banisters gleaming under the chandelier's golden glow. Lady Beatrice Ashford, the dowager of the house, had always insisted on its polish, a reflection of her own unyielding pride. At 78, she was a wisp of a woman, her frame brittle as porcelain, yet her eyes held the steel of one who had outlived 2 husbands and a son. Tonight, dressed in a high-necked gown of lavender silk, she had dined alone, her household dismissed to their duties. The clock in the hall struck 9, its chimes swallowed by the winds. How Clara, the maid, was in the kitchen, scrubbing. The last of the silver, her hands, rough from years of service, moved mechanically, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on her brother's hospital bills, paid by Lady Beatrice's grudging charity. Gerald, the dowager's nephew, sprawled in the library, a glass of brandy in hand, his handsome face clouded as he pored over racing forms. Dr. Henry Vaughan, who had called earlier to check on his patient, had left for the village, his black bag swinging as he braved the storm. Lydia Crane, Lady Beatrice's companion, lingered in the drawing-room, her needlepoint forgotten as she stared into the fire, her pale cheeks betraying some inner turmoil. Each was absorbed, each apart. When the silence of the house was rent by a cry, it was not a scream of pain but of shock, sharp and fleeting, followed by a sickening thud. Clara dropped her cloth, her heart lurching. Gerald's glass froze midway. To his lips, Lydia's needle slipped, pricking her finger. They converged on the hall, their footsteps uneven, to find Lady Beatrice at the foot of the grand staircase, her body unnaturally still, her lavender gown fanned across the marble, one slipper dangling from a foot, her head tilted at an angle that spoke of finality. Her eyes, wide open, stared at the chandelier above, as if accusing its light of betrayal. "Good God," Gerald muttered, his voice hoarse. He knelt, fumbling for a pulse, but his hands shook, and he drew back. Clara, clutching her apron, stifled a sob. Lydia stood rigid, her lips parted but silent, her eyes darting to the stairs. The scene held them, a tableau of grief and suspicion, until the village constable arrived, summoned by a breathless footman. He was a ruddy-faced man, more accustomed to lost sheep than death, and his pronouncement was hesitant. A fall, most likely, old ladies and stairs, a bad mix. He scratched his head, avoiding the dowager's glassy stare. Word of the tragedy reached St. Mary Mead by morning, carried on the wings of gossip. Miss Jane Marple, knitting by the fire in her cottage, heard it from her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who burst in with the news. Beatrice Ashford, dead. They say she tripped, but I don't believe it, Jane. Not at Greystone. That house has secrets. Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes sharpening. She had met Lady Beatrice once, at a charity bazaar, and recalled her imperious air, the way she'd spoken of loyalty as if it were a commodity to be bought. A fall, Miss Marple said softly, is a simple thing, but simplicity can hide a multitude of sins. By noon, Mrs. Bantry had secured an invitation to Greystone, ostensibly to offer condolences, but with the unspoken intent of bringing Miss Marple along. "You'll see through it, Jane," she said, as they drove through the windswept lanes. "You always do." Miss Marple, her knitting bag on her lap, said nothing, but her mind was already at work, sifting the fragments of what she'd heard. A proud woman, a grand staircase, a household of dependents. As the car crested the hill and Greystone Manor loomed into view, its turrets stark against the stormy sky, she murmured, "Stairs are treacherous things, Dolly, but so are the hearts that linger near them." Chapter 2. The household under scrutiny, the morning after Lady Beatrice Ashford's fatal fall. Greystone Manor seemed to hold its breath. The storm had passed, leaving a sky of brittle blue and a damp chill that seeped through the stone walls. The grand hall, where the dowager's body had lain only hours before, was now pristine, the marble floor scrubbed to a mirror sheen by Clara's diligent hands. Yet the air carried a weight, as if the house itself mourned its mistress, or guarded her secrets. Miss Jane Marple, stepping from Mrs. Dolly Bantry's car, adjusted her woolen shawl and surveyed the manor's facade. Its mullioned windows stared back, unyielding, like eyes that had seen too much. "A fine house," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, "but fine houses often hide troubled hearts." Mrs. Bantry, her hat slightly askew from the drive, was in high spirits, her curiosity sharpened by the prospect of tragedy. "I told you, Jane, it's no accident. Beatrice Ashford was as tough as old boots, tripping on her own stairs. Poppycock." She bustled toward the entrance, where the butler, a stooped man named Hargreaves, awaited. Miss Marple followed, her steps measured, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. She had a way of moving, hurried, almost delicate, that maid. Others overlook her, a quality she'd honed over years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead. Today, her mild blue eyes missed nothing: the faint tremor in Hargreaves' hand as he took their coats, the polished banister of the grand staircase, and the faint scuff on its third step, barely visible but telling. They were ushered into the drawing-room, a cavernous space of damask curtains and mahogany furniture, where the household had gathered for tea. The fire crackled in the grate, casting shadows that danced across the portraits of Ashfords long gone. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Wuna, severe woman in Victorian black, her eyes eerily like Lady Beatrice's. The living occupants, however, commanded her attention. Clara, the maid, stood by a sideboard, arranging a silver tea service with a precision that bordered on obsession. Her dark hair was pinned tightly, her apron starched, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped a sugar tongs. Gerald Ashford, the dowager's nephew, lounged in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, his tailored suit impeccable, yet somehow at odds with the restless flick of his fingers. Dr. Henry Vaughan, seated near the window, adjusted his spectacles, his face a mask of professional calm, though his eyes darted to the door. Lydia Crane, the companion, perched on a settee, her hands folded in her lap, her grey dress blending with the shadows. Her face, pale and angular, betrayed no emotion, but her stillness was that of a coiled spring. Mrs. Bantry, never one for subtlety, launched into condolences. "Such a dreadful shock," she said, accepting a cup from Clara. "Poor Beatrice. to go like that, and on those stairs. I always said they were too steep." Her tone invited contradiction, and Gerald obliged, his voice smooth but edged. "Aunt Beatrice was stubborn about them. Refused a lift or even a cane. Said the stairs kept her young." He gave a wry smile, but his eyes slid to Lydia, who stared at her hands. Miss Marple, settling into a chair, noted the exchange. "Stubbornness," she said mildly, her needles clicking as she drew yarn from her bag, "is a quality that often provokes strong feelings. Admiration, perhaps, or frustration." The room stilled, as if her words had plucked a hidden string. Dr. Vaughan cleared his throat. "Lady Beatrice's health was frail," he said, his tone measured. "Her heart, you see. A fall, even a minor one, could have been catastrophic." He spoke with the authority of one accustomed to being believed, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw. Clara, pouring tea, let a drop spill, her apology swift, and whispered. Lydia's head lifted, her gaze meeting Miss Marple for a fleeting moment before dropping again. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred, pressed on. But surely someone heard something. A cry, a stumble. That hall echoes like a cathedral. Gerald shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "I was in the library, reading. Didn't hear a thing until Clara screamed." His nonchalance was practiced, but Miss Marple saw the way his thumb rubbed the cigarette case, a nervous tick. Clara, handing her a cup, murmured, "I was in the kitchen, ma'am. I only came when I heard the sound." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple patted her hand. "A dreadful moment, my dear. You must have been quite shaken." Clara nodded, her eyes downcast, but her fingers lingered on the saucer, as if reluctant to let go. Lydia spoke then, her voice low but clear. "I was in here, working on my needlepoint. Lady Beatrice had gone up early. She said she was tired." Her words were precise, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's needles paused. "Tired," she echoed. "Yet she climbed those stairs alone, a determined lady." Lydia's lips pressed thin, and she said no more. Dr. Vaughan interjected, "Perhaps, too quickly. She was determined, yes. I advised rest, but she rarely listened." His smile was tight, and Miss Marple wondered what else he'd advised and what he'd withheld. The conversation turned to Lady Beatrice's character, a subject that loosened tongues. Gerald painted her as eccentric but generous, recounting how she'd funded his Oxford education, though he admitted she'd grown sharp in recent years. "Always harping on about duty," he said, exhaling smoke. "Thought I should settle down, manage the estate, as if I'm cut out for ledgers." His laugh was hollow, and Miss Marple recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, all charm and no purpose, who'd run through his inheritance in a season. Clara, clearing plates, spoke of her mistress's charity, though her tone hinted at the cost. Of that generosity demands slights, a temper that flared without warning. Dr. Vaughan described a patient who refused to acknowledge her frailty, while Lydia, when pressed, called her a woman of strong will, not easily swayed. Each portrait was vivid, yet incomplete, like pieces of a mosaic scattered on a table. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth steadying her thoughts. She had a way of listening, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. Gerald's casual air-masked unease. His debts, rumoured in the village, were a shadow behind his charm. Clara's loyalty seemed genuine, but her trembling hands suggested fear or guilt. Dr. Vaughan's clinical detachment was too perfect, like a mask donned for an audience, and Lydia, with her quiet reserve, was a cipher, her devotion to Lady Beatrice tinged with something unspoken. Miss Marple thought of a neighbour in St. Mary Mead, a widow who'd nursed an ailing sister only to inherit her fortune. Devotion, she knew, could be a mask for darker motives. Mrs. Bantry, sensing a lull, steered the talk to the night of the fall. Surely someone saw her go up, she said, her eyes bright. Wasn't there a light on the stairs? Gerald shook his head. She liked it dim, said it was romantic. Lydia nodded, adding, she always took the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister. Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple caught the faint quiver in it. Dr. Vaughan, perhaps, eager to shift focus, mentioned Lady Beatrice's insomnia, a condition he'd treated with mild sedatives. Though she rarely took them, he added, his fingers adjusting his spectacles again. Miss Marple made a mental note. Sedatives, insomnia, a dim staircase. Small details, but in her experience, small details were the threads that unravelled lies. The tea tray was cleared, and the household dispersed. Gerald to the billiard room, Dr. Vaughan to his car, Lydia to her duties, Clara to the kitchen. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the room's opulence, the Persian rug, the ormolu clock, the velvet drapes. Wealth, she knew, bred envy, and envy bred desperation. Mrs. Bantry, gathering her gloves, whispered, "What do you think, Jane? There's something off, isn't there?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking once more. "There's always something off, Dolly, when death comes too suddenly. It's like a dropped stitch in a pattern. You don't see it at first, but it changes everything." As they stepped into the hall, Miss Marple paused by the grand staircase. Its steps, wide and shallow, were not treacherous by design, yet the scuff on the third step nagged at her. She bent slightly, as if adjusting her shoe, and noted its position too high for a stumble, too low for a deliberate mark. "Careful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, mistaking her pause. Miss Marple straightened, her expression serene. "Oh, I'm always careful, Dolly, but I'm also curious." Her gaze lingered on the banister, smooth and unmarred, and she thought of hands steady or shaking that might have touched it last night. In the car, as Greystone Manor receded behind them, Mrs. Bantry chatted about the household's oddities. Gerald's charm, Clara's nerves, Lydia's reserve. Miss Marple listened, her mind elsewhere. She saw the drawing room again, not its elegance, but its occupants, each bound to Lady Beatrice by need or duty. Gerald with his debts, Clara with her brother's bills, Dr. Vaughan with his professional pride, Lydia with her shadowed past, and at the centre, Lady Beatrice, a woman whose wealth and will had shaped them all until a push or a stumble had ended her reign. "It's the why, Dolly," Miss Marple said at last, interrupting her friend's monologue. "Why she fell, and why someone might have wanted her to. That's where the truth lies." Mrs. Bantry, momentarily silenced, nodded. "You'll find it, Jane. You always do." Miss Marple said nothing, her needles clicking in rhythm with the car's hum. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight behind lace curtains, in church pews, over teacups. Greystone Manor was grander, its stakes higher, but human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere. As the car wound through the Devon lanes, she began to knit, not wool but thoughts, weaving a pattern only she could see. The household was under scrutiny, and Miss Jane Marple was watching. Chapter 3. The Will and the Whisper. The late morning sun cast long shadows through the oriel windows of Greystone Manor, gilding the dust motes that danced in the quiet air. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room, with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, sipped her tea and observed the subtle currents of unease that rippled through the household. The room, with its chintz curtains and rosewood table, was a softer contrast to the grandeur of the drawing-room, yet it carried the same weight of expectation. Lady Beatrice Ashford's death, now a day old, hung over the manor like a fog, and the question of her will, its contents, its secrets, had begun to stir whispers among those left behind. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, listened not to the words spoken but to the silences that followed. Mrs. Bantry, ever the catalyst, had orchestrated this second visit under the guise of delivering a condolence wreath, though her true aim was to keep Miss Marple's sharp eyes on the household. "It's the will, Jane," she said, her voice low as they waited for the others to join them. "Beatrice was rich as Croesus, and you know how money stirs people up. Gerald's bound to get the lot, but there's talk of something else. Codicil, they say." Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of intrigue. Miss Marple nodded, her expression placid. "Money," she said, "is a great revealer of character. It shows what people value most and what they fear to lose." She thought of a spinster in St. Mary Mead who'd left her savings to a distant cousin, only for the cousin to squander it on a motor car. Promises, she knew, were as fragile as the paper they were written on. The door opened, and Gerald Ashford entered, his stride confident but his smile strained. He wore a tweed jacket, its casual cut at odds with the tension in his jaw. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he greeted, sinking into a chair. "Kind of you to come again. The house feels empty without Aunt Beatrice." His tone was practiced, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of his gaze toward the door, as if expecting or dreading another's arrival. Clara followed, pushing a tea trolley with a clatter of china. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements jerky, as if sleep had eluded her. Lydia Crane slipped in last, her grey dress blending with the room's shadows, her face a mask of quiet composure. Dr. Vaughan, Miss Marple learned, was delayed by a patient in the village, a fact that Gerald mentioned with a touch of irritation. Mrs. Bantry seized the moment. "We were just speaking of Lady Beatrice's legacy," she said, accepting a scone from Clara. "She was so generous, wasn't she? I suppose, Gerald, you'll be taking over the estate now?" Her question was blunt, and Gerald's laugh was a shade too loud. "Oh, I expect so. Aunt Beatrice always said I was the last of the Ashfords, but she loved her little games, codicils, bequests, all that rot, kept her solicitor busy." He waved a hand, dismissing the topic, but his eyes darted to Lydia, who was pouring tea with a steadiness that seemed forced. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Games," she said softly, "can be dangerous when the stakes are high. A codicil, for instance, might change everything." The word hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Clara's hand faltered, and a teaspoon clattered onto the tray. She murmured an apology, her cheeks flushing, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered on the trolley, as if anchoring herself. Lydia's cup rattled faintly in its saucer, though her expression remained serene. Gerald stubbed out his cigarette, his nonchalance fraying. "If there's a codicil, I know nothing of it," he said, a touch too quickly. "Aunt Beatrice was secretive, liked to keep us guessing." His smile was thin, and Miss Marple thought of a young man in her village, all bravado, who'd hidden a gambling debt until the bailiffs came. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred, pressed on. "But surely someone knows. Her solicitor, perhaps. Or you, Miss Crane, you, was so close to her." Lydia's head lifted, her pale eyes meeting Mrs. Bantry's with a calm that felt deliberate. "Lady Beatrice confided in me about many things," she said, her voice low, but not her will. She valued privacy. The words were measured, yet Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her lips, as if more lay unspoken. Clara, clearing a plate, seemed to shrink into herself, her movements mechanical. Miss Marple's mind turned to a housemaid in St. Mary Mead, who'd overheard a will's reading, and let slip a secret that changed a family's fate. Servants, she knew, saw more than they were meant to. The conversation shifted to Lady Beatrice's character, a topic that loosened tongues but sharpened Miss Marple's focus. Gerald spoke of his aunt's pride in the Ashford name, her insistence that he uphold it, though he admitted her standards were exacting. "She'd lecture me for hours," he said, lighting another cigarette, "about duty, legacy. Thought I should marry well and produce an heir. As if I've time for that." His laugh was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed on the armrest, a rhythm of unease. Lydia described a woman of fierce independence, who trusted few but demanded absolute loyalty. "She was kind to me," she added, her voice softening, "when I had nowhere else to go." The sentiment was touching, yet Miss Marple sensed a shadow behind it, a debt, perhaps, or a fear. Clara, when prompted, spoke haltingly of her mistress's generosity, though her words carried a bitter edge. "She paid for my brother's doctor," she said, her hands twisting in her apron, "but she'd remind me of it every day. Said I owed her." Her voice broke, and she turned away, busying herself with the trolley. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts on a village shopkeeper who'd lent money to a neighbour, then wielded the debt like a whip. Obligation, she knew, could breed resentment as easily as gratitude. The door opened, and Dr. Vaughan entered, his black bag in hand, his manner brisk but apologetic. "Forgive my tardiness," he said, taking a chair. A patient with a fever couldn't be helped. His spectacles glinted as he accepted tea, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Despite the room's chill, Mrs. Bantry, eager to draw him in, repeated her question about the will. Dr. Vaughan's response was cautious. "Lady Beatrice was private about such matters," he said, stirring his tea, though she did seem anxious lately. "Her heart condition, you note, preyed on her mind." He sipped, his eyes avoiding Gerald's, and Miss Marple wondered what anxieties he'd witnessed or ignored. The talk turned to the night of the fall, a subject that tightened the room's atmosphere. Gerald reiterated his story. He'd been in the library, lost in a book, unaware of his aunt's movements. Lydia confirmed she'd been in the drawing room, her needlepoint a distraction from the storm's howl. Clara, in the kitchen, had heard nothing until the cry that brought her running. Dr. Vaughan, who'd left the manor earlier, offered no insight, though he mentioned Lady Beatrice's recent restlessness. "She spoke of betrayal," he said, almost as an afterthought, "but I thought it was her nerves." The word betrayal landed like a stone, and Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, catching Gerald's frown, Lydia's stillness. Clara's flinch. Mrs. Bantry pounced. "Betrayal? By whom?" Dr. Vaughan hesitated, his fingers adjusting his spectacles. "She didn't say. I assumed it was a fancy old age, you know." But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple thought of a doctor in St. Mary Mead who'd dismissed a patient's fears only to regret it later. She leaned forward, her tone gentle. "Fancies, Dr. Vaughan, often have roots in truth. Did she mention anyone by name?" He shook his head, but his discomfort was palpable, and Miss Marple filed it away, a thread to pull later. As the tea was cleared, Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly. She bent to retrieve it, her eyes scanning the floor near the morning room's threshold, where a rug curled faintly at the edge. It was a small thing, but she noted it, just as she'd noted the scuff on the staircase. Small things, in her experience, were the keys to larger truths. Gerald escorted them to the hall, his charm resurfacing as he thanked them for their visit. Lydia followed, silent, her gaze lingering on Miss Marple as if trying to read her thoughts. Clara hovered by the door, her apron twisted in her hands, while Dr. Vaughan departed with a nod, his bags swinging as he hurried to his car. In the car, Mrs. Bantry was alight with theories. That codicil, Jane, it's the key. Gerald's hiding something, and Lydia knows more than she lets on. And Clara, did you see her jump when you mentioned it? Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. They all know something, Dolly. The trick is finding what and why they keep it hidden. She thought of the morning room, its warmth masking a chill of suspicion. Gerald's debts, Clara's debt to her mistress, Lydia's devotion. Dr. Vaughan's cautionage was a piece of a puzzle, and the codicil was its missing centre, as Greystone Manor faded behind the Devon hills. Miss Marple's mind turned to the whisper of betrayal Dr. Vaughan had let slip. It was a word that echoed in her memory, from a case in St. Mary Mead where a whispered accusation had unravelled a family. A secret, she murmured, almost to herself, is like a crack in a dam. It starts small, but it grows until everything breaks. Mrs. Bantry, catching her words, grinned. You're onto something, Jane. I can feel it. Miss Marple said nothing, but her needles moved faster, weaving a pattern of truth that was beginning to take shape. Chapter 4. The Maid's Memory. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of Greystone Manor's kitchen, casting a soft glow on the flagstone floor and the copper pots that hung in gleaming rows. The storm's aftermath had left the air crisp, and a faint scent of damp earth drifted in from the open scullery door. Miss Jane Marple, having excused herself from Mrs. Bantry's animated conversation in the drawing-room, found her way to this humbler part of the house, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She had a knack for slipping into places where confidences were shared, and kitchens, she knew, were the heart of any household secrets. In St. Mary Mead, she'd learned more from a cook's gossip than from a dozen formal inquiries, and she sensed Clara, the maid, held threads of truth that the grander rooms concealed. Clara stood at a long oak table, polishing a silver candelabra with a cloth that moved in slow, deliberate circles. Her dark hair was pinned tightly, but a few strands had escaped, framing a face drawn with fatigue. Her apron, though spotless, bore faint creases from nervous twisting, and her hands, rough from years of scrubbing, trembled slightly as she worked. She started at Miss Marple's soft knock, her eyes widening before she dipped her head. "Ma'am," she murmured, setting the candelabra down. "I didn't expect. Can I fetch you something? Tea, perhaps?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as warm as a fireside. "No tea, thank you, my dear. I only thought I'd see how you're managing. Such a shock, losing your mistress so suddenly." She settled onto a stool by the table, her needles clicking as she drew yarn from her bag. The sound, rhythmic and soothing, seemed to ease the tension in Clara's shoulders, and Miss Marple noted the way the maid's fingers relaxed, if only slightly. "It must be hard," she continued, "working in a house where such a thing has happened." Clara hesitated, then resumed her polishing, her movements less frantic. "It's quiet now, ma'am. Too quiet." Her ladyship was strict, but kept things lively. Her voice was low, tinged with a weariness that spoke of more than sleepless nights. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting but her attention on Clara's every word. She thought of a parlour maid in St. Mary Mead, whose quiet confessions over a cup of cocoa had revealed a theft no one suspected. Servants, she knew, were the unseen eyes of a house, catching what others missed. "You were fond of her, I think," Miss Marple said gently, despite her strictness. Clara's cloth paused, and she bit her lip. "She was good to me, in her way. Paid for my brother's doctor when he was ill. Consumption, it was. Without her, he'd not be here." Her voice softened, but there was a shadow in it, a hint of something owed. Miss Marple's needles clicked, and she recalled a village grocer who'd accepted charity but chafed under its weight. "Kindness," she said, "can come with strings, can't it? Even the best intentioned." Clara's eyes met hers, brief but searching, as if weighing whether to speak. Then she nodded, her cloth moving again. "She'd remind me, ma'am, every week, almost said I was lucky to have a place here, that I should be grateful." Her tone was matter of fact, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of resentment, faint but unmistakable. She leaned forward slightly, her voice as soft as a whisper. "And were you grateful, Clara, or did it ever feel too heavy a burden?" The question hung in the air, and Clara's hands stilled. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, save for the distant drip of a tap and the faint rustle of Miss Marple's yarn. Then Clara spoke, her voice barely audible. "I tried to be, but she could be cruel. Called me careless once, in front of the others, when I broke a teacup. It wasn't my fault, but she wouldn't hear it." She swallowed, her eyes on the candelabra as if it held her confession. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind alight. Cruelty, even in small doses, could fester, and Clara's loyalty, she sensed, was laced with wounds. "Tell me about that night," Miss Marple said, her tone shifting to one of quiet curiosity. "You were here, in the kitchen, weren't you?" Clara nodded, her cloth resuming its slow circles. "Yes, ma'am. Washing up after dinner. Her ladyship ate alone, as usual. She'd sent me down early, said she didn't need me fussing." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight emphasis on fussing, a hint of irritation recalled. "And then," she prompted, her needles steady. Clara's brow furrowed, as if piecing together a memory she'd rather forget. "I was at the sink when I heard voices. From the hall, I think. Sharp, like an argument. I couldn't make out the words, but one was her ladyship's. She had that way of cutting through, you know, the other. I'm sure it was Miss Crane." Her voice dropped, and she glanced at the door, as if fearing Lydia's shadow might appear. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "Miss Crane," she echoed. "That's interesting. Did you see them?" Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am. I stepped to the passage, but they'd stopped by then. I saw Miss Crane go back to the drawing room, and her ladyship was at the foot of the stairs, starting up. She looked angry, I suppose. I went back to my work." Her fingers tightened on the cloth, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders hunched, as if shielding herself from the memory. "And then?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Then I heard the cry," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Not loud, but sharp, like a gasp, and the thud. I ran out, and there she was, at the bottom, all twisted up in her gown." Her eyes filled, and she turned away, wiping her hands on her apron. Miss Marple reached out, touching her arm lightly. "A terrible thing to see," she said. "You did what you could, I'm sure." Clara nodded, but her tears spilled over, and Miss Marple gave her a moment, knowing grief could unlock more than questions. As Clara composed herself, Miss Marple's mind turned to the argument. Lydia Crane, so composed in the drawing-room, had clashed with Lady Beatrice moments before her fall. An argument, even a brief one, could mean many things: disagreement, defiance, desperation. She thought of a St. Mary Mead seamstress who'd quarrelled with her employer over a late payment, only for the employer to die under questionable circumstances. Words, she knew, could be the spark that lit a fatal fire. "Did you hear anything else that night?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "Before the cry, perhaps. Footsteps, or another voice." Clara frowned, thinking, I'm not sure. There was Mr. Gerald, earlier. I saw him in the library, pacing, muttering to himself. Something about money, I think. He didn't see me. I was bringing in the coal." Her voice was steadier, now, as if the act of remembering anchored her. Miss Marple's needles clicked, and she filed away the image of Gerald, restless and muttering. His debts a spectre that haunted the manor, and Dr. Vaughan, Miss Marple prompted. Was he still here? Clara shook her head. He'd gone by then, ma'am. Left after checking on her ladyship's heart. Said she was stable, but he looked worried. I heard him tell Miss Crane to keep an eye on her. She paused, then added, Miss Crane didn't seem pleased. Said it wasn't her job to nurse me. The last was said with a trace of defiance, and Miss Marple noted it. Sensing a rift between the maid and the companion, however slight. The kitchen door creaked, and Hargreaves, the butler, appeared, his face a mask of polite inquiry. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry is asking for you, he said, his tone deferential but firm. Clara stiffened, her cloth moving faster, and Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting away. Thank you, Clara, she said warmly. You've been most helpful. And mind you, Restouve had a trying time. Clara managed a small smile, but her eyes were wary, and Miss Marple wondered what else she might have said without interruption. In the passage, Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the door to the hall. The grand staircase was just beyond, its polished steps a silent witness to Lady Beatrice's fall. She thought of Clara's words, the argument, Gerald's muttering. Lydia's reluctance, and felt the pattern of the case tightening, like a shawl taking shape on her needles. Clara's memory was a thread, fragile but vital, and Miss Marple knew it led somewhere dark. Memories, she murmured to herself, are like footprints in the snow. They fade, but they show where someone's been. She rejoined Mrs. Bantry. In the drawing-room, where her friend was holding court with Gerald, her questions about the manor's history a thinly veiled excuse to probe. Jane, there you are, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her hat now thoroughly askew. I was just saying how Greystone's full of stories, but you've been sleuthing, haven't you? Her grin was conspiratorial, and Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. Only chatting, Dolly, she said, her needles resuming their rhythm. But her mind was elsewhere, weaving Clara's words with the whispers of the will, the scuff on the stair, and the shadow of betrayal that Dr. Vaughan had mentioned. The maid's memory had opened a door, and Miss Marple was already stepping through. Chapter 5. The nephew's alibi. Gardens of Greystone Manor, though touched by autumn's chill, retained a defiant splendour. Box hedges, clipped to geometric precision, framed paths of raked gravel, and late roses clung to their thorns, their petals bruised but unyielding. Miss Jane Marple, having slipped away from Mrs. Bantry's relentless chatter in the morning room, wandered these paths, her shawl drawn tight against the breeze. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a familiar weight, but her eyes were not on the blooms. They scanned the manor's windows, the stone arches, and the figure of Gerald Ashford, who stood by a sundial, his cigarette smoke curling into the crisp air. She had sought him out deliberately, sensing that the nephew, with his charm and his debts, was a knot in the tangle of Lady Beatrice's death. Gerald turned at the sound of her footsteps, his handsome face breaking into a smile that was all polish and no warmth. "Miss Marple," he called, flicking ash into the grass. "Escaping the tea trays, are you? Can't say I blame you." His voice was light, but his eyes were restless, darting to the manor as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as milk. "Oh, I enjoy a bit of fresh air," she said, pausing by a rose bush. "And gardens are such good places for thinking, don't you find?" She bent to inspect a bloom, her fingers brushing its petals, but her attention was on Gerald, whose laugh was a touch too sharp, thinking. "I leave that to the philosophers," he said, lighting another cigarette. "I'm more for action racing, cards, that sort of thing." He exhaled, the smoke veiling his face, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand trembled, just slightly, as he held the match. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead, all bravado and bad bets, who'd pawned his mother's silver to cover a loss. "Action," she said softly, "can be costly, Mr. Ashford, especially when one's luck runs thin." Gerald's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, leaning against the sundial. "You've heard the village talk, I suppose. My debts, my wild ways." He shrugged, as if dismissing a trifle. "Aunt Beatrice was always bailing me out. Said I was the future of the Ashfords, for better or worse." His tone was flippant, but Miss Marple caught the edge in it, the hint of a man who knew his future hung by a thread. She straightened, her needles clicking as she drew yarn from her bag. "She was fond of you, then," she said. "That must have been a comfort." "Fond?" Gerald's laugh was bitter now. "She was fond of control, loved having me in her pocket, dangling promises of the estate. But she'd have settled my debts, given time, always did." He stubbed out his cigarette, grinding it into the gravel, and Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed, as if grasping for something just out of reach. She thought of Clara's memory Gerald, pacing the library, muttering about money, and her gaze sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. "And the night she died?" she asked, as if it were the most natural question. "You were in the library, I believe you said. Reading, wasn't it?" Gerald's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, his charm resurfacing like a well-worn mask. "That's right. Some dull biography she'd recommended. I was there until Clara's scream brought me running." He met her gaze, his expression open, but Miss Marple noted the way his left hand slipped into his pocket, a gesture of concealment. She recalled the St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd lied about his whereabouts, his hands betraying him with their restless movements. "Alone, I suppose," she said, her needles steady. "It's a big house for solitude." Gerald nodded again, too quickly. "Just me and the books." The others were scattered: Clara in the kitchen, Lydia in the drawing room. Aunt Beatrice had gone up early. His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation before early, as if he'd rehearsed the line but not its timing. She tilted her head, her eyes as bright as a bird's, and no one passed by. No voices, no footsteps. "The hall's not far from the library, is it?" Gerald's smile tightened, and he lit another cigarette, though the last still smouldered at his feet. "Not a soul," he said. The storm was loud-whined. Rain, you know, drowned out everything. He exhaled, the smoke a barrier between them, and Miss Marple thought of the scuff on the staircase. The argument Clara had overheard between Lady Beatrice and Lydia. Gerald's alibi was flimsy, a single thread in a fraying fabric, and she sensed he knew it. Storms, she said, can hide many things, but they pass, and what's hidden comes to light. He laughed, a forced sound, and changed the subject, pointing to the roses. Aunt Beatrice loved these, had them tended like children. Pity they're fading now. His voice was casual, but Miss Marple saw the way his eyes flicked to the manor. Again, as if drawn to its secrets. She followed his gaze, noting the library window, its curtains half drawn, and wondered what he'd truly been doing that night, reading, or pacing, or something else entirely. She thought of the codicil, the whisper of a secret bequest, and Gerald's ignorance of it, as he'd claimed. Ignorance, she knew, could be feigned, and desperation could drive a man to act. "Tell me," she said, her tone conversational. "Did your aunt ever speak of her plans? Her will, perhaps, or changes to it?" Gerald's hand froze midway to his lips, the cigarette trembling. Her will, she was cagey about that. Said I'd get the estate, but she liked her mysteries. Codicil's secrets kept us all on edge. He forced a grin, but his eyes were wary, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading at his temple, despite the cool air. She recalled a St. Mary Mead bachelor who'd lied about a legacy, his nerves betraying him over a glass of sherry. Mysteries, she said, can be unsettling, especially when they involve money. Gerald's grin faded, and he turned away, pretending to study the sundial. "Money's always a bother," he muttered, "but I didn't need to push her down the stairs for it, if that's what you're thinking." His words were bold, but his voice cracked, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "Oh, I think very little, Mr. Ashford," she said. "I only notice, and I've noticed you're not quite at ease." Her tone was kind, almost maternal, but her eyes were sharp, and Gerald's face flushed, his charm crumbling. Before he could respond, the crunch of gravel announced Mrs. Bantry, her hat bobbing as she approached. "Jane, there you are. I've been talking to Lydia, such a strange girl, all silences and stares. What have you found out?" Her voice carried, and Gerald seized the chance to escape, muttering about a telephone call. Miss Marple watched him go, his stride too quick, his cigarette left burning on the sundial's edge. She thought of Clara's words about his muttering, of the debts that shadowed him, and of the library's proximity to the grand staircase. An alibi, she knew, was only as strong as the truth behind it. Mrs. Bantry, linking arms with her, was alight with theories. "He's hiding something, isn't he? Those debts, Jane, they're the key. A man like that, desperate for cash, and his aunt dangling the estate like a carrot." She lowered her voice, though the garden was empty. "Do you think he did it? Pushed her, I mean?" Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "I think, Dolly, that Gerald Ashford is a man with much to lose, but whether he pushed her or someone else did depends on what else he's hiding." Her needles resumed their rhythm, and she thought of the scuff on the stair, the argument, the codicil. Gerald's alibi was a piece of the puzzle, but it was cracked, and Miss Marple was determined to find what lay beneath as they walked back to the manor. The roses seemed to watch, their fading petals a reminder of time's relentless march. Miss Marple's mind turned to the household, Clara's resentment, Lydia's reserve, Dr. Vaughan's caution, and now Gerald's flimsy story. Each was a thread, and the truth was the pattern they formed. Alibis, she murmured, almost to herself, are like promises. They sound solid, but they break under pressure. Mrs. Bantry, catching her words, grinned. You're closing in, Jane, I can tell. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were bright, and the garden path seemed to lead not to the manor, but to the heart of a mystery. Chapter 6. The doctor's diagnosis. The village of St. Mary Mead, though miles from Greystone Manor, shared its knack for gossip, and by mid afternoon, the tragedy of Lady Beatrice Ashford's fall had woven itself into the chatter of its tie-rooms and post office. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not in St. Mary Mead. She stood in the dim antiseptic-scented interior of the village pharmacy near Greystone, her knitting bag at her side, ostensibly to purchase a tin of lozenges. The real purpose of her visit was Dr. Henry Vaughan, whom she'd spotted through the pharmacy's window, collecting a prescription. She had a way of encountering people at just the right moment, a skill honed by years of observing the ebb and flow of human secrets. The pharmacy was a narrow space, its shelves crammed with bottles and boxes, the air heavy with the scent of camphor and lavender. Behind the counter, Mr. Gibbs, the pharmacist, shuffled papers, his bald head gleaming under the electric light. Dr. Vaughan stood nearby, his black bag on the counter, his spectacles fogged slightly from the transition from cool air to warmth. He was a man of precise movements, his grey suit immaculate. But Miss Marple noted the faint crease between his brows, a sign of strain that his professional calm could not mask. "Good afternoon, Dr. Vaughan," she said, her voice as bright as a spring morning. "I didn't expect to find you here, though I suppose a doctor's work never ends." Vaughan turned, his surprise giving way to a polite smile. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "A pleasure, though the circumstances are grim. Just picking up some tonic for a patient." He patted his bag, as if to emphasize his duty, but Miss Marple caught the way his fingers lingered on the clasp, a gesture of unease. She stepped closer, her shawl slipping slightly, and bent to retrieve a fallen handkerchief, her eyes scanning the counter. A small bottle, labelled with Lady Beatrice's name, sat among Vaughan's items, its presence a quiet clue. "Such a sad business at Greystone," she said, straightening. "Poor Lady Beatrice. You must have known her well, being her doctor." Vaughan nodded, his expression sombre. "For nearly a decade," he said. "She was a challenging patient, refused to coddle her ailments. Her heart was weak, though, and I warned her often about overexertion." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to the bottle, then away. She thought of a St. Mary Mead physician who'd misjudged a patient's symptoms, his confidence blinding him to danger. "A weak heart," she echoed, her needles clicking as she drew yarn from her bag. "That would make a fall especially perilous, wouldn't it?" "Indeed," Vaughan said, warming to the topic. "The shock alone could have been fatal, even without the impact. A sudden fright, a stumble her heart wouldn't have withstood it." He spoke with the authority of one accustomed to being heeded, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, as if he were defending a diagnosis already questioned. She tilted her head, her eyes bright but gentle. "And yet she climbed those stairs nightly," she said. "A determined woman to risk so much." Vaughan's smile was thin. "Determined to a fault. I advised a ground-floor bedroom, but she wouldn't hear of it. Said the manor was her domain, and she'd not be confined." He adjusted his spectacles again, a habit Miss Marple had come to recognize as a shield. She thought of Clara's mention of Vaughan's worry that night, his instruction to Lydia to watch Lady Beatrice. "You saw her that evening, I believe," she said, her tone conversational. "Before she went up, was she in good spirits?" Vaughan hesitated, his fingers brushing the bottle on the counter. "As good as could be expected," he said. "She was restless, complained of palpitations. I checked her pulse, found it steady enough, and left her with Miss Crane." His words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight pause before restless, as if he'd chosen the word with care. She recalled Gerald's flimsy alibi, Lydia's argument with Lady Beatrice, and now Vaughan's reticence. Each piece was a thread, and the doctor's diagnosis, she sensed, was not the whole story. "Restless," she repeated, her needle steady. "That's curious. I've heard she spoke of betrayal in her final days. Did she mention anything to you?" Vaughan's hand froze on his bag, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flicker of alarm. "Betrayal," he said, his voice a shade to light. "She was fanciful at times, Miss Marple. Old age, you know, makes one see slights where none exist." He forced a chuckle, but it rang hollow, and Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who'd accused her nephew of theft, only for the truth to prove darker. "She didn't name anyone, then?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice as soft as a whisper. Vaughan shook his head, his spectacles glinting as he turned to Mr. Gibbs, signalling for his prescription. "No names," he said, "just vague talk. I put it down to her nerves and prescribed a sedative, though she rarely took it." He busied himself with the bottle, slipping it into his bag, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers fumbled, betraying unnerves of his own. She leaned forward, her tone unchanged. "A sedative," she said. "That's interesting. Might it have made her unsteady on the stairs?" Vaughan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Unsteady? No, no. It was mild, a mere tincture. And as I said, she seldom used it. She was sharp to the end. Miss Marple too sharp, perhaps." His voice held a trace of irritation, and Miss Marple smiled, as if conceding the point. But her mind was racing, piecing together the sedative, the restlessness, the betrayal. She thought of the scuff on the staircase, Clara's overheard argument, and Gerald's pacing. Vaughan's diagnosis was clinical, but it left gaps, and Miss Marple was adept at finding what lay within them. Mr. Gibbs approached, handing Vaughan a wrapped package, and the doctor seized the chance to shift focus. "You're staying with Mrs. Bantry, I hear," he said, his tone lighter. "She's quite the character, isn't she? Always stirring things up." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Dolly's a dear," she said. "She loves a mystery, though she's not always patient for the answers." Her words were mild, but her gaze was steady, and Vaughan's smile faltered, as if he sensed the net tightening dot as he gathered his bag. Miss Marple stepped to the counter, selecting a tin of lozenges with deliberate care. "One last thing, Dr. Vaughan," she said, as if it were an afterthought. "Did Lady Beatrice ever seem afraid? Of anyone in the household, perhaps?" Vaughan paused, his hand on the door, and for a moment she thought he might answer, but he shook his head, his voice firm. "Afraid? No, she was too proud for that. If you'll excuse me, I've patients waiting." He nodded curtly and left, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. Miss Marple paid for her lozenges, exchanging pleasantries with Mr. Gibbs, who mentioned Vaughan's frequent visits for Lady Beatrice's prescriptions. Always particular. He was, Gibbs said, polishing the counter. Checked every label twice. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. As she stepped into the street, the wind tugged at her shawl and she paused, her eyes on the retreating figure of Dr. Vaughan, his black bag swinging as he hurried to his car. She thought of the bottle on the counter, the sedative, and the betrayal that Lady Beatrice had feared. Vaughan's diagnosis was a piece of the puzzle, but it was incomplete, and Miss Marple knew that truth often hid in what was left unsaid. She made her way to the village square, where Mrs. Bantry waited in her car, her hat askew and her face alight with impatience. "Jane, you've been ages. What did you find? Was it Vaughan? He's too smooth. If you ask me, like a snake in spectacles." She laughed, but her eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple settled beside her, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Dr. Vaughan is careful, Dolly," she said. "But careful men make mistakes when they're frightened. And I think he's frightened of something." She thought of the household Gerald's debts, Clara's resentment, Lydia's argument, and now Vaughan's guarded words. Each was a thread, and the sedative, she sensed, was a knot that tied them together. As the car rumbled toward St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Bantry peppered her with questions, but Miss Marple's answers were vague, her mind elsewhere. She saw the grand staircase again, the scuff on its step, and Lady Beatrice's crumpled form. "Diagnoses," she murmured, almost to herself, "are like maps. They guide you, but they don't always show the hidden paths." Mrs. Bantry, catching her words, grinned. "You're on to him, Jane. I knew it." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were bright, and the pharmacy's dim light seemed to linger, illuminating a truth that was slowly taking shape. Chapter 7. The Companion's Secret to the Cliffs of Devon. Jagged and windswept, stretched beyond Greystone Manor like a challenge to the sea below. The afternoon sky was a patchwork of clouds, their shadows racing across the gorse and heather that clung to the rocky slopes. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl pinned tightly against the brisk air, walked the cliff path with Lydia Crane, Lady Beatrice Ashford's companion. Mrs. Bantry had stayed behind, citing a sudden need to write letters, but Miss Marple suspected her. Friend's true motive was to give her space to probe the enigmatic Miss Crane. Lydia, in her grey coat and sensible shoes, moved with a quiet grace, but her pale face was taut, like porcelain stretched to its breaking point. Miss Marple, her knitting bag swinging lightly, sensed that Lydia's reserve hid a secret as sharp as the cliffs themselves. The invitation for the walk had been Miss Marple's, offered with a disarming smile over luncheon at the manor. "A breath of sea air does wonders," she'd said, and Lydia, after a moment's hesitation, had agreed, her eyes wary but curious. Now, as they followed the narrow path, the roar of the waves below mingled with the cry of gulls, creating a wild symphony that seemed to loosen the silence between them. Miss Marple, her steps careful on the uneven ground, began with the lightest of touches. "You must miss Lady Beatrice terribly," she said, her voice soft but clear. "To be her companion for so long, it's a bond not easily broken." Lydia's gaze remained on the horizon, where the sea churned grey and restless. "She was my life here," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. "I came to Greystone with nothing, and she gave me a purpose." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in them, a hint of something deeper than gratitude. She thought of a governess in St. Mary Mead, who'd served a family faithfully but harboured a private grief that shaped her. "Every choice." "A purpose," Miss Marple echoed, her needles clicking as she paused to adjust her shawl. "That's a precious thing, but it can weigh heavily, can't it?" Lydia's step faltered, just for a moment, and she turned, her pale, eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a guarded intensity. "It was my duty," she said. "She relied on me for her letters, her appointments, her moods. She wasn't an easy woman, but I understood her." Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles white. She recalled Clara's account of the argument in the hall, Lydia's sharp words with Lady Beatrice, and the companion's reluctance to nursemaid her mistress. Duty, she knew, could mask resentment as easily as devotion. They walked on, the path curving closer to the cliff's edge, where a wooden bench faced the sea. Miss Marple suggested they rest, and Lydia complied, sitting with her hands folded, her posture rigid. The bench was weathered, its plaque commemorating an Ashford ancestor, and Miss Marple traced its inscription absently, her mind on Lydia's. Past. Village gossip, relayed by Mrs. Bantry, had hinted at a scandal in London, a broken engagement, a reputation tarnished. "You've not always been at Greystone," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "It must have been a change, coming from the city to this quiet place." Lydia's lips pressed thin, but she nodded. "I needed a fresh start," she said. "London was unkind. Lady Beatrice offered me a position when no one else would. She didn't care about rumours." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the shadow that crossed her face, a memory she'd rather keep buried. She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl who'd fled to London after a jilting, only to return with secrets she never shared. "Rumours," Miss Marple said gently, "can be cruel. But they often start with a grain of truth, don't they?" Lydia's hands tightened in her lap, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might rise and walk away, but she stayed, her gaze fixed on the sea. "It was a misunderstanding," she said at last. "A man I thought I'd marry, he changed his mind. People talked, said I'd chased him for his money. It wasn't true, but it followed me." Her voice was brittle, and Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "People are quick to judge," she said. "But Lady Beatrice saw your worth. That must have meant a great deal." "It did," Lydia said, her tone softening. "She trusted me more than the others. Gerald, Clara, they had their own concerns, but I was there for her, always." The words were fervent, almost defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way Lydia's eyes flicked to her, as if seeking approval or absolution. She thought of the codicil, the secret bequest that Gerald claimed to know nothing of, and wondered how much Lydia knew. "Always," Miss Marple repeated. "That's a rare loyalty. Did she ever share her plans with you? Her will, perhaps?" Lydia's face went still, her eyes narrowing. "Her will," she said, her voice sharp. "No, she kept that private. She'd joke about it sometimes, said it would surprise everyone. But she never told me details." Her words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. She recalled Gerald's unease at the mention of a codicil, Clara's trembling hands, Dr. Vaughan's guarded diagnosis. Lydia's denial was a thread, but it was frayed, and Miss Marple sensed a lie beneath it. "Surprises," she said, "can be unsettling, especially when they involve secrets." Lydia stood abruptly, brushing her coat as if to shake off the question. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice tight. "Lady Beatrice was good to me. I had no reason to pry." She started down the path, her steps brisk, and Miss Marple followed, her pace unhurried but deliberate. The wind tugged at her shawl, and she thought of the argument Clara had overheard, the anger in Lady Beatrice's voice. Lydia's devotion was a mask, she sensed, and the codicil was the crack that threatened to shatter it. They reached a fork in the path, one branch leading back to the manor, the other toward a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea. Lydia hesitated, then chose the outcrop, as if drawn to its solitude. Miss Marple followed, her eyes on the companion's rigid back. "That night," she said, her voice carrying over the wind, "you were in the drawing room, weren't you? When Lady Beatrice went up." Lydia stopped, her shoulders stiffening, but she didn't turn. "Yes," she said. "I told you that. I was working on my needlepoint, and you heard nothing." Miss Marple pressed, her tone as gentle as a caress. "No voices, no cry." Lydia turned then, her face pale but composed. "The storm was loud," she said. "I didn't hear anything until Clara screamed." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight quiver in her lip, the way her eyes avoided hers. She thought of the scuff on the staircase, the sedative Dr. Vaughan had prescribed, and Clara's memory of Lydia's argument. "Storms," Miss Marple said, "can drown out many things, but not everything." Lydia's gaze hardened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might snap. But she only nodded, her voice cold. "I've told you all I know, Miss Marple. I was loyal to her. I'd never have hurt her." She turned away, starting back toward the manor, and Miss Marple let her go, her needles clicking as she stood by the outcrop, the sea churning below. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who'd hidden a lover's betrayal behind a mask of piety, her secret unraveling over a single careless word. Lydia's secret, she sensed, was tied to the codicil, and her loyalty was a shield for something darker. By the time Miss Marple returned to the manor, Lydia had disappeared upstairs, and Mrs. Bantry was in the hall, her hat askew and her face alight with gossip. "Jane, you're back. I've been talking to Hargreaves' door, old stick, but he let slip that Lydia's been jumpy since the fall. What did you get out of her?" She linked arms with Miss Marple, steering her toward the car, and Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "Lydia Crane is a woman with a past, Dolly," she said, "and I think her past is why she's so afraid of the present." In the car, Mrs. Bantry peppered her with questions, but Miss Marple's answers were vague, her mind on the cliff path, Lydia's brittle denial, and the codicil that loomed over them all. She saw the grand staircase again, the scuff, the crumpled form of Lady Beatrice. "Secrets," she murmured, her needles moving faster, are like stones in a pocket. They weigh you down until you let them go. Mrs. Bantry, catching her words, grinned. "You've got her number, Jane. I knew it." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were bright, and the sea's roar seemed to echo, carrying the weight of a truth that was closer than ever. Chapter 8. The solicitor's revelation. The train to Exeter rattled through the Devon countryside, its rhythm a counterpoint to the steady click of Miss Jane Marple's knitting needles. She sat by the window, her shawl neatly folded, her eyes tracing the patchwork of fields and hedgerows that blurred past. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, opposite her, fidgeted with her gloves, her hat slightly askew from the bustle of boarding. The journey, though short, was a deliberate one, orchestrated by Mrs. Bantry's insistence that they consult Mr. Pettigrew, Lady Beatrice Ashford's solicitor, about the will that had stirred such unease at Greystone Manor. "It's the codicil." "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice low despite the empty carriage. "That's what's got them all on edge, Gerald. Lydia, even Clara. We need to know what it says." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight with the threads she'd gathered. Clara's overheard argument, Gerald's flimsy alibi, Dr. Vaughan's guarded diagnosis, and Lydia's brittle denial. The codicil, she sensed, was the knot that bound them. Exeter's streets were alive with the hum of market day, carts and shoppers weaving through the cobbled lanes. Mr. Pettigrew's office, tucked above a bookshop, was a contrast of quiet order, its walls lined with leather-bound ledgers and the air heavy with the scent of ink and wax. Pettigrew himself was a small, fastidious man, his pince-nez perched on a nose that seemed made for peering over documents. He greeted them with a bow, his manner formal but warmed by Mrs. Bantry's effusive charm. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to 2 plush chairs. "A sad business. Lady Beatrice is passing. I trust you're here on a matter of condolence." His tone was polite, but his eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on his desk, a sign of curiosity or caution. Mrs. Bantry, never one for preamble, launched into her purpose. "Condolences, yes, but also clarity, Mr. Pettigrew. Lady Beatrice's Willits, the talk of the county. There's a codicil, isn't there? Something secret. We thought you might shed light for poor Gerald's sake." Her voice was all concern, but her eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple suppressed a smile, knowing her friend's knack for bending truth to suit her ends. Pettigrew adjusted his pince-nez, his expression guarded. "The will is a private matter," he said, "but as you're friends of the family, I suppose a general outline does no harm." He rose, retrieving a file from a cabinet, and Miss Marple watched his movements, precise but tinged with reluctance. She thought of a St. Mary Mead, solicitor who'd guarded a client's secrets until a single question unravelled his discretion. "Wills," she said softly, her needles clicking, "are like mirrors. They show what a person values most." Pettigrew glanced at her, his brow creasing, but he nodded, settling back at his desk. "Quite so, Miss Marple. Lady Beatrice valued her legacy, the Ashford name, the manor. Her will reflects that." He opened the file, though he scarcely glanced at it, suggesting a familiarity with its contents. The bulk of her estate, Greystone Manor, its lands, and the majority of her fortune goes to her nephew, Gerald Ashford, as the last of the line. Smaller bequests were made to staff, including Clara, for her years of service. He paused, his fingers tapping the file, and Miss Marple's needles paused. Sensing a hesitation, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her impatience barely veiled. "And the codicil," she pressed. "There is one, isn't there? Everyone's whispering about it." Pettigrew sighed, a sound of resignation, and removed his pince-nez, polishing them with a handkerchief. "Yes, there is a codicil," he said. "Added some months ago, at Lady Beatrice's insistence. She was quite particular about it." He leaned back, his gaze shifting between the 2 women, as if weighing how much to reveal. Miss Marple's eyes were bright but gentle, inviting confidence, and he continued, his voice lower. "It provides a bequest of £20,000 to Miss Lydia Crane, her companion, on the condition that she remain in Lady Beatrice's service until her death." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her gloves forgotten. 20,000. Good heavens. That's a fortune. Did Gerald know? Pettigrew shook his head, his lips pursing. No, Lady Beatrice was explicit. Gerald was not to be told. She feared it might complicate matters. Miss Crane, however, was informed, as the condition affected her directly. He replaced his pince-nez, his fingers steady now, as if unburdening himself had eased a weight. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was racing, weaving Lydia's denial on the cliff path with this new revelation. £20,000 was motive enough for desperation, and Lydia's knowledge of it changed everything. complicate matters," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. "That's an interesting choice of words. Did Lady Beatrice say why she made such a bequest?" Pettigrew hesitated, his eyes flicking to the file. "She said Miss Crane had earned it through loyalty, she called it. But she was anxious when she signed it, kept saying she needed to be sure of her. I thought it odd, but she wouldn't elaborate." His voice held a trace of unease, and Miss Marple thought of Dr. Vaughan's mention of betrayal, Clara's overheard argument, and Lydia's guarded demeanor. Loyalty, she knew, could be a mask for obligation or deceit. Mrs. Bantry, her excitement barely contained, pressed further, and no one else knew. Not Clara, not Dr. Vaughan. Pettigrew shook his head. "Only Miss Crane and myself. As far as I'm aware, Lady Beatrice was adamant about secrecy." He closed the file, signalling the end of disclosures, but Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice as soft as a whisper. "One last thing, Mr. Pettigrew. Did Lady Beatrice ever speak of changing the codicil, of revoking it, perhaps?" His eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he might deflect. But he nodded, almost reluctantly. "She did, a week before her death. Telephoned to arrange a meeting, said she'd had second thoughts, but she died before we could meet." The words landed like a stone, and Mrs. Bantry's gasp filled the room. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her gaze steady, a threatened change. To the codicil, a secret bequest, an argument over herdage was a piece of a pattern, and Lydia Crane was at its centre. She thought of a St. Mary Mead spinster who'd altered her will after a falling out, only for tragedy to intervene. "Second thoughts," she said, "can be dangerous, especially when someone else has much to lose." Pettigrew offered sherry to lighten the mood, and Mrs. Bantry accepted with enthusiasm, her questions now a flurry of speculation. Miss Marple sipped sparingly, her mind on Lydia's pale face, her claim of ignorance about the will. The cad was a motive, and Lady Beatrice's threat to revoke it was a spark that could have ignited panic. As they thanked Pettigrew and descended the narrow stairs, Mrs. Bantry was alight with theories. Lydia knew Jane. £20,000, and Beatrice was going to take it away. That's why they argued, isn't it? She pushed her eyed. "Bet my best hat on it." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl as they stepped into the bustling street. "It's a strong motive, Dolly," she said, "but motives are like shadows, they shift depending on the light." She thought of Gerald's debts, Clara's resentment, Dr. Vaughan's sedative, and now Lydia's secret. The train back to St. Mary Mead was quieter, Mrs. Bantry dozing as the countryside rolled past. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. She saw Lydia pouring tea, her hands steady but her eyes haunted, and the grand staircase, its scuff a silent witness. "A secret worth killing for," she murmured, "but only if the heart is desperate enough." As the train neared their station, Mrs. Bantry stirred, her hat now thoroughly askew. "You've got it solved, haven't you, Jane? I can see it in your eyes." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. "Not solved, Dolly, but the pieces are falling into place, and the codicil is one of them." Her needles moved faster, weaving a pattern of truth that was almost complete. The solicitor's revelation had opened a door, and Miss Marple was ready to step through, into the heart of Greystone Manor's darkness. Chapter 9. The night reconstructed, the drawing-room of Greystone Manor, bathed in the amber glow of its chandelier, seemed to hold its breath as evening settled over the Devon cliffs. The heavy damask curtains were drawn, shutting out the restless sea, and the fire in the great cast flickering shadows across the portraits of Ashford's past. Miss Jane Marple sat in a backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her needles silent for once. Her mild blue eyes, sharp as ever, surveyed the room's occupants Gerald Ashford, Clara, Dr. Henry Vaughan, and Lydia Crane, who had gathered at her quiet but insistent request. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, perched on a settee, vibrated with anticipation, her hat slightly askew, sensing the moment Miss Marple had been building toward. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and the weight of Lady Beatrice Ashford's death pressed upon them all. Miss Marple had chosen this moment carefully. After the solicitor's revelation of the codicil and her probing conversations with each suspect, the threads of the case Clarice overheard argument, Gerald's flimsy alibi, Dr. Vaughan's guarded diagnosis, Lydia's hidden motive had woven a pattern in her mind, and now she sought to test it. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle, but firm, carrying the authority of one who saw truths others missed. "I've asked you here," she began, "because Lady Beatrice's death was no accident. A fall, perhaps, but one caused by a hand other than her own. We must reconstruct that night, step by step, to find the truth." Gerald, lounging in an armchair, lit a cigarette, his casual air strained. "Really, Miss Marple, this is a bit theatrical, isn't it? The constable said it was an accident. Old ladies fall." His voice was smooth, but his fingers twitched, betraying unease. Clara, standing by the tea tray, clutched her apron, her eyes darting to the door. Dr. Vaughan adjusted his spectacles, his professional calm faltering, while Lydia, seated near the fire, sat rigid, her pale hands folded like a shield. Mrs. Bant, unable to contain herself, leaned forward. "Oh, Gerald, don't be obtuse. Jane's onto something, and you know it." Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile disarming. "Let us begin with the facts," she said. "That night, Lady Beatrice dined alone, then retired early, insisting on climbing the grand staircase unaided. She was found at its foot, her life ended by a fall or a push. Each of you was in the house, save Dr. Vaughan, who had left earlier. Let us hear your accounts again, plainly." Her tone invited no argument, and she turned to Gerald first, her gaze steady. "Mr. Ashford, you were in the library, reading, you said. Alone." Gerald exhaled smoke, his eyes narrowing. "As I've told you, yes, some dreary book on history. I didn't hear a thing until Clara's scream." His words were clipped, and Miss Marple noted the way his left hand slipped into his pocket, a gesture she'd seen in the garden. She thought of Clara's memory of him pacing, muttering about money and the debts that shadowed him. "The library," she said, "is near the hall. A cry, even in a storm, might carry. Yet you heard nothing." Gerald's jaw tightened, but he shrugged. Storm was loud, drowned it out. Miss Marple turned to Clara, whose hands twisted in her apron. "And you, Clara? You were in the kitchen, washing up." Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am. I heard voices earlier, her ladyship and Miss Crane arguing in the hall. Then nothing until the cry." Her eyes flicked too. Lydia, then away, and Miss Marple recalled the maid's trembling confession in the kitchen, the resentment beneath her loyalty. "Arguing," Miss Marple echoed. "That's significant. And you saw Miss Crane return to the drawing room?" "Yes," Clara whispered, her cheeks flushing. Her ladyship was starting up the stairs, looking cross. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the scuff on the third step, a mark too deliberate for a stumble. She turned to Dr. Vaughan, who sat erect, his spectacles glinting. You, Dr. Vaughan, were gone by then, but you saw Lady Beatrice earlier. She was restless, you said, and you prescribed a sedative. Might it have affected her balance? Vaughan cleared his throat, his voice measured. As I explained, the sedative was mild, and she rarely took it. She was alert when I left, though anxious stalked of betrayal, but vaguely. His fingers adjusted his spectacles, a habit Miss Marple now recognized as a shield. She thought of the bottle in the pharmacy, his unease when questioned, and wondered what else he'd withheld. Betrayal, she said softly. A heavy word. Did she hint at its source? Vaughan shook his head, but his eyes darted to Lydia, and Miss Marple filed the glance away. Finally, she turned to Lydia, whose stillness was like a statue's, her pale face unreadable. Miss Crane, you were in the drawing-room, working on your needlepoint. You heard nothing until Clara's scream. Lydia's eyes met hers, steady but guarded. That's right, she said, her voice low. The storm was fierce. I was focused on my work. Her words were precise, but Miss Marple recalled her denial on the cliff path, her knowledge of the codicil, and Clara's account of the argument. And the voices Clara heard. Miss Marple pressed. You and Lady Beatrice in the hall. Lydia's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained calm. We spoke briefly. She was tired, wanted to retire. I urged her to rest, but she was stubborn. Her tone was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight quiver in her lip, a crack in her composure. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but piercing. Spoke or argued. Clara heard raised voices, and Lady Beatrice was angry. What was it about Miss Crane? The room stilled, the fire's crackle the only sound. Gerald's cigarette paused midway to his lips. Clara's breath caught, and Dr. Vaughan's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward. Lydia's face paled further, but she held Miss Marple's gaze. It was nothing, she said. She was upset about a letter, some trifling matter. I calmed her, and she went up. Her words were firm, but Miss Marple thought of the codicil £20,000, contingent on her service, and Lady Beatrice's threat to revoke it. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who'd quarrelled with her maid over a bequest, the tension simmering until it broke. Nothing, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Yet it was enough to anger her. And then she felt or was pushed. She paused, letting the words settle, and turned to the group. Let us consider. The night. Lady Beatrice climbs the stairs, alone, after an argument with Miss Crane. Gerald is in the library, Clara in the kitchen, Dr. Vaughan gone. Yet someone was near enough to act. The scuff on the third step suggests a struggle, not a stumble. And the codicil £20,000 to Miss Crane, known only to her, and the solicitor gives a motive. Gerald snorted, breaking the tension. You're saying Lydia pushed her? For money? That's absurd. But his eyes were wary, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, despite the room's chill. Lydia's face flushed, and she rose, her voice sharp. I loved her. I'd never harm her, codicil or not. Her outburst was sudden, and Clara flinched, while Dr. Vaughan's hand froze on his spectacles. Miss Marple remained calm, her gaze fixed on Lydia. Love, she said, can be desperate, Miss Crane, and desperation makes us do things we never thought possible. She turned to Gerald, her voice steady. Your debts, Mr. Ashford, were a burden. Did you know of the codicil? Despite your claims, a reduced inheritance might have pushed you to act. Gerald's face reddened, but he shook his head. I told you I knew nothing of it. I was in the library. Miss Marple nodded, then looked to Clara. Your loyalty was strained by Lady Beatrice's cruelty. Did resentment drive you to follow her? Clara's eyes filled, and she shook her head, whispering, No, ma'am, I couldn't. To Dr. Vaughan, she said, Your sedative, however mild, might have clouded her senses. Did you fear her accusations of betrayal? Vaughan bristled, his voice sharp. I did my duty, nothing more. Miss Marple nodded, then returned to Lydia, her gaze unrelenting. You argued with Lady Beatrice, Miss Crane. She threatened to change her will, didn't she? To revoke the codicil that promised you freedom. Lydia's composure shattered, her hands trembling as she sank back into her chair. She accused me of disloyalty, she whispered. Said I'd betrayed her trust, that she'd cut me out. I begged her to listen, but she wouldn't. Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. The room was silent, save for the fire's crackle, and Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her resolve held firm. And in that moment, she said, You followed her to the stairs, didn't you? Pleading, perhaps, until a push ended it all. Lydia's sob was the only answer, and Miss Marple knew the truth was near. She thought of the scuff, the argument, the codicil's weight. The night, she said, tells its own story, and the truth will not stay hidden. Mrs. Bantry, gripping her arm, whispered, You've done it, Jane. But Miss Marple's gaze remained on Lydia, whose tears were a confession yet to be spoken. Chapter 10. The Confession. The drawing room of Greystone Manor. Its chandelier, dimmed to a soft glow, seemed to contract under the weight of Miss Jane Marple's words. The fire's embers pulsed, casting long shadows that wavered across the faces of the assembled household: Gerald Ashford, Clara, Dr. Henry Vaughan, and Lydia Crane. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her hat forgotten on the settee, gripped the armrest, her eyes wide with the thrill of revelation. Lydia, crumpled in her chair, her pale face streaked with tears, was the focal point of the room, her earlier composure shattered by Miss Marple's relentless probing. The air was taut, as if the manor itself awaited the final unmasking of Lady Beatrice Ashford's killer. Miss Marple stood, her slight figure commanding despite its fragility, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle but unyielding, carrying the quiet authority of one who had unraveled human frailties before. Miss Crane, she said, her eyes fixed on Lydia, you have told us of your loyalty to Lady Beatrice, of the argument that night, and of her threat to revoke the codicil that promised you £20,000. But there is more, isn't there? A moment on the stairs, a desperate act that changed everything. Her words were not an accusation, but a bridge inviting truth across the chasm of denial. Lydia's hands trembled in her lap, her grey dress blending with the shadows. She shook her head, but the gesture was feeble, her eyes darting to the others: Gerald's scowl, Clara's tearful stare, Dr. Vaughan's rigid silence. I didn't mean it, she whispered, her voice breaking like thin ice. I swear, I didn't mean to hurt her. The words hung in the room, a confession half-formed, and Miss Marple stepped closer, her presence as steady as a lighthouse in a storm. Tell us, my dear, she said. The truth is a burden, but it lightens when shared. Gerald slammed his cigarette case on the table, his face flushed. This is nonsense. Lydia, you don't have to say another word. She's spinning tales. That's all. But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes avoided Lydia's. Clara, clutching her apron, sobbed softly, while Dr. Vaughan adjusted his spectacles, his fingers betraying a tremor. Mrs. Bantry, unable to stay silent, whispered, "Let her speak, Gerald. Jane knows what she's doing." Lydia's gaze met Miss Marple's, and for a moment the room seemed to fade, leaving only the two women, one seeking truth, the other trapped by it. "It was the codicil," Lydia said at last, her voice barely audible. "She told me about it months ago, said it was my reward for loyalty. £20,000 I could start over, leave the whispers of London behind. But she changed, grew suspicious. That night she accused me of stealing a brooch, said I'd betrayed her trust. She was going to change the will, cut me out entirely." Her words spilled faster now, a dam breaking under pressure. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unwavering. "And you argued in the hall, as Clara heard," she said. "You pleaded with her, didn't you?" Lydia's tears fell anew, and she nodded, her hands twisting together. "I followed her to the stairs, begging her to listen. She was so angry, said I was no better than a thief. I grabbed her arm just to make her stop, to hear me. She pulled away, and I pushed. Not hard, I swear, but she lost her balance. Her voice choked, and she covered her face, her sobs muffled. The room was silent, save for the fire's faint hiss and Clara's stifled weeping. Gerald stared at Lydia, his cigarette forgotten, his face a mask of shock. Dr. Vaughan's spectacles slipped, and he made no move to adjust them. His clinical detachment shattered. Mrs. Bantry's mouth hung open, her excitement giving way to horror. Miss Marple, unmoved by the drama, stepped closer, her voice soft but clear. "And she fell," she said. "The scuff on the third step, the cry, Clara heard it, was a moment of panic, wasn't it? Not murder in your heart, but a mistake born of fear." Lydia nodded, her hands falling to her lap. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said, her voice raw. "I ran down after her, saw her there, so still. I wanted to scream, to undo it, but Clara came, and then Gerald, and I couldn't." "Say it." She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I was afraid. The codicil, my futurette, was all slipping away, and I panicked." Her confession was complete, and the room seemed to exhale, the tension breaking like a wave. Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she touched Lydia's shoulder, a gesture of compassion rather than judgment. "Fear," she said, "is a powerful force. It clouds the mind, turns good intentions to ruin. You loved her in your way, but love and fear are a dangerous mix." She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl who'd pushed a rival in a moment of jealousy, her regret as deep as her crime. Turning to the others, she continued, her voice steady. "The truth is out now. Lady Beatrice's death was no accident, but nor was it cold-blooded. A push, a fall, a heart too weak to withstand the shock." Gerald rose, his face pale. "You're saying she's a murderer?" His voice was hoarse, and Miss Marple shook her head. "Not murder, Mr. Ashford. Manslaughter, perhaps, born of a moment's desperation. The law will decide, but the truth is what matters here." Clara, wiping her eyes, whispered, "I knew it wasn't right, ma'am." The way Miss Crane looked that night, he saw it in her eyes. Dr. Vaughan cleared his throat, his voice subdued. "I should have pressed her about. The betrayal she feared. Perhaps I could have prevented this." His admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple noted the guilt in his eyes, a weight he'd carry beyond this room. Mrs. Bantry, recovering her voice, clapped her hands. Jane, you've done it. I knew you'd get to the bottom of it. But her triumph was tempered by the sight of Lydia, broken and weeping, and she fell silent, her hat sliding further askew. Miss Marple turned to her friend, her smile gentle. It's not a victory, Dolly. It's a tragedy, for all of them. She looked at Lydia, whose tears had slowed, her face a mask of resignation. You must tell the constable, Miss Crane, she said. It's the only way to find peace. Lydia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I will. I can't carry it any more. She rose, her movements slow, as if the confession had drained her strength. Clara stepped forward, hesitating, then touched her arm, a small gesture of forgiveness. Gerald turned away, his cigarette case clenched in his hand, while Dr. Vaughan gathered his bag, his face drawn. Miss Marple watched them, her mind on the grand staircase, the scuff, the codicil that had sparked such ruin. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small betrayals led to small redemptions, and wished Greystone's story could end as gently as the household dispersed Lydia to her room. Gerald to the library, Clara to her duties, Vaughan to his calmness. Marple remained, her knitting bag untouched. Mrs. Bantry, gathering her things, whispered, You're a marvel, Jane, but how did you know it was her? Miss Marple's eyes were distant, seeing not the drawing-room but the pattern she'd woven. It was the codicil, Dolly, she said, and the fear in her eyes. Desperation leaves a mark, like a scuff on a stair. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of truth, and Mrs. Bantry, for once, had no reply. Chapter 11. The aftermath. Morning after Lydia Crane's confession. Greystone Manor stood under a sky of unrelenting grey, its stone walls absorbing the damp chill that rose from the Devon cliffs. The grand staircase, once the stage of tragedy, was silent, its polished steps gleaming as if to erase the memory of Lady Beatrice Ashford's fall. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag packed and her shawl neatly folded, prepared to depart with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose car idled in the drive. The household, shaken by the truth, moved through its routines with a muted air, each member grappling with the wreckage of Lydia's act. Miss Marple, her mild blue eyes as sharp as ever, observed the subtle shifts in their demeanour, knowing that truth, while freeing, left scars that lingered. Lydia had been taken into custody by the village constable, a solemn man who arrived at dawn with a motor car and a pair of handcuffs he used with reluctance. She went quietly, her pale face composed but her eyes hollow, as if the confession had drained her of all but resignation. Clara, watching from the hall, had wept, her apron twisted in her hands, while Gerald turned away, his cigarette smoke curling like a veil. Dr. Vaughan, present to offer a sedative if needed, stood by with his black bag, his professional mask restored but his silence heavy with Miss Marple, standing aside, had noted the scene with a quiet sorrow, thinking of a St. Mary Mead girl who'd faced justice for a theft born of desperation, her village forever changed by her absence. Now, as Miss Marple adjusted her hat in the Manor's hall, Gerald approached, his tailored suit rumpled, his charm replaced by a raw honesty. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, I owe you thanks and an apology. I was a fool to think it was just a fall, but Lydia, he trailed off, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her gaze steady. You were protecting your own hopes, Mr. Ashford, she said, but the truth has a way of cutting through. What will you do now? Gerald exhaled, his eyes on the staircase. Settle the debts, sell what I must. Aunt Beatrice wanted the Ashford name to endure. I'll try, for her. His resolve was fragile, but Miss Marple nodded, seeing a flicker of the man he might become. She thought of a St. Mary Mead lad who'd squandered his inheritance, but found redemption in honest work. Clara, bringing their coats, paused to speak, her red-rimmed eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "I'm staying on, ma'am," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Gerald needs help, and it's what her ladyship would have wanted. I'm sorry for Miss Crane, but I'm glad it's out." Her hands were steady now, the weight of suspicion lifted, and Miss Marple patted her arm. "You've a good heart, Clara," she said, "and a strong one. Greystone is lucky to have you." Clara's smile was faint but genuine, and Miss Marple recalled a village maid hood weathered scandal to hold her family together. Her loyalty, a quiet strength. Dr. Vaughan, descending the stairs, offered a curt nod, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone formal, "your insight was remarkable. I should have seen her distress, questioned her fears more closely." His admission was grudging, but Miss Marple saw the guilt in his eyes, a burden he'd carry. To his practice. "We all miss things, Dr. Vaughan," she said kindly, "but you did your duty, and that's no small thing." He nodded, his bag swinging as he left, and Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd learned humility. After a misdiagnosis, his skill sharpened by regret. Mrs. Bantry, bustling in from the car, broke the sombre mood, her hat now hopelessly askew. "Jane, we'll miss the train if you dawdle, though I must say, what a triumph. You've set them all straight, and Lydia, well, it's sad, but justice is done." Her voice was bright, but her eyes softened as she glanced at the staircase, and Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "Justice, Dolly, is a cold comfort," she said, "but it clears the air like a storm passing." She took one last look at the hall, the staircase, the portraits that watched in silence. The scuff on the third step was gone, polished away, but its memory lingered in her mind, a mark of truth uncovered in the car. As Greystone receded behind the hills, Mrs. Bantry chattered about the case, her theories now tinged with awe. "You saw it all, Jane the codicil, Lydia's fear, that wretched push. How do you do it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, her knitting resumed at last, and she looked out at the passing fields, their greener balm after the manor's shadows. "I don't see, Dolly," she said. "I listen to the silences, the hesitations, the things people don't say. Human nature is the same, whether in St. Mary, Mead, or Greystone. It's the secrets we keep that undo us." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her hat sliding further, and for once, she let the silence linger, sensing the weight of her friend's words. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lydia, whose desperation had cost so much, and to Lady Beatrice, whose pride had set the stage for tragedy. She saw the household Gerald's resolve, Clara's loyalty, Vaughan's regret, knew they'd carry on, scarred but stronger. "It's the living," she murmured, almost to herself, "who bear the cost." Of truth, Mrs. Bantry, catching her words, squeezed her arm. "You're too wise, Jane, but thank heavens for it." As the car wound towards St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knitted, her needles weaving a pattern of wool and memory. Greystone's secrets were laid bare, its ghosts quieted, if not at peace. She thought of the codicil, the argument, the scuff, and Lydia's tears, each a thread in a tapestry now complete. The manor faded into the distance, but its lessons remained. A reminder that even the grandest houses hid frail, fallible hearts. Chapter 12. The return to St. Mary Mead, trained from Devon to St. Mary Mead. Chugged through a landscape softened by late afternoon light, its fields and copses bathed in the golden haze of autumn. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting bag nestled beside her, her needles moving with the steady rhythm that had accompanied her through the unravelling of Greystone Manor's tragedy. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, across from her, dozed fitfully, her hat finally abandoned on the seat, her snores a gentle counterpoint to the train's clatter. The weight of Lydia Crane's confession, the codicil's revelation, and Lady Beatrice Ashford's death lingered in Miss Marple's mind, but the familiar approach to St. Mary Mead brought a quiet calm, like the return of a melody long cherished. Her cottage, when they arrived, was as she'd left it, the roses in the garden nodding under their own weight, the lace curtains stirring at the open windows, the kettle waiting on the stove. Miss Marple declined Mrs. Bantry's offer of tea at Gossington Hall, sensing her friend's fatigue and her own need for solitude. "You've had quite an adventure, Dolly," she said, her smile warm as she stepped from the car. "Rest now, and we'll talk tomorrow." Mrs. Bantry, yawning, waved her off. "You're a marvel, Jane. Greystone won't forget you, and neither will I." The car rumbled away, and Miss Marple entered her home, the scent of lavender and beeswax welcoming her like an old friend. She lit the fire, set the kettle to boil, and settled in her armchair, her knitting resumed with a skein of soft blue wool. The village, she knew, would soon buzz with the tale of Greystone Manor, carried by Mrs. Bantry's eager tongue and the postmistress's letters. Already, snippets of gossip had reached St. Mary Mead, the dowager's fall, the companions, guilt, the codicil that sparked it all. But Miss Marple had little taste for such chatter. Her interest lay not in the story's spread, but in its lessons, the truths it revealed about the human heart. As the fire crackled, she thought of Lydia Crane, whose desperation for a new life had led to a fatal push. The codicil £20,000, a fortune to a woman with a shadowed past, had been her hope and her undoing. Miss Marple recalled Lydia's tears, her broken confession in the drawing-room, and the weight of fear that had driven her. She thought, too, of Lady Beatrice, proud and imperious, whose suspicion had provoked the very betrayal she feared. Their story was a mirror to St. Mary Mead, where small jealousies and hidden wants could turn neighbour against neighbour if left unchecked. Her mind wandered to the others. Gerald Ashford, his debts a chain he now vowed to break, his resolve a fragile promise. Clara, whose loyalty endured despite her mistress's cruelty, her strength a quiet beacon. Dr. Vaughan, his professional pride humbled by a truth he'd failed to see. Each had been touched by the tragedy, their lives reshaped by the scuff on the staircase, the argument in the hall, the codicil's secret. Miss Marple's needles clicked, weaving wool and memory, and she saw Greystone's grand hall again, its polished steps a silent witness to human frailty. The kettle whistled, and she rose to make tea, her movements unhurried. As she poured, the steam curling like a ghost, she reflected on her own role. She had not sought the mystery, but it had found her, as mysteries often did. Her gift, if it could be called that, was in seeing what others overlooked: the tremor in a hand, the pause in a voice, the silence that spoke louder than words. In St. Mary Mead, she'd honed this skill over teacups and church bozers, learning that pride, fear, and love were the currents that drove even the quietest lives to ruin. She sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and thought of a St. Mary Mead spinster who'd hidden a theft to save her brother, her shame uncovered by a single careless remark. Lydia's crime was graver, her push a moment of panic, but the root was the same, a heart stretched taut by need. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to her garden, where the roses bowed under evening's dew. "We're all capable of darkness," she murmured, "but light comes with honesty." The words were for no one but herself, a reminder of the delicate balance she navigated in every case. The village clock struck 6, its chime carrying through the open window, and Miss Marple set her cup down, her knitting complete for the day. Tomorrow she'd tend her roses, visit the vicarage, listen to the gossip that swirled like leaves in the wind. But tonight she was content to sit, the fire's glow a companion as steady as her thoughts. Greystone Manor was behind her, its secrets laid bare, its wounds left to heal. Lydia faced justice, Gerald a new path, Clara a purpose, Vaughan a lesson. The dowager's death was a tragedy, but it had freed the living to face their truths. Miss Marple rose, drawing the curtains against the gathering dusk. The world outside was quiet, but she knew its currents never stilled. Somewhere another secret waited, another heart teetered on the edge of folly. She would be ready, as always, with her needles and her unassuming gaze, seeing what others could not. For now, though she turned to the kitchen, the promise of a simple supper calling. The mystery was solved, the pattern complete, and St. Mary Mead, with its roses and its truths, was home.